Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. It all started on a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon. I was trimming the hedges along my property line when I heard the unmistakable sound of expensive heels clicking rapidly on the sidewalk. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Karen Wisman, our HOA president, clipboard in hand, and that familiar look of righteous indignation plastered across her face. Karen had been the Homeowners Association president of Whispering Pines for 3 years running, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. But she treated it like she was running a small country with nuclear capabilities. Her blonde, highlighted bob haircut was always perfectly styled, her clothes always designer brand, and her attitude always set to maximum condescension. Karen, speaking in a shrill voice, said, excuse me, Mr. Marshall. What exactly do you think you're doing to that fence?" I turned slowly, pruning shears still in hand, and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Karen. Just doing some routine maintenance on my property. Is there a problem?" I made sure to keep my tone professional and calm, something I perfected through years of dealing with difficult clients in my architectural engineering practice. Karen's perfectly highlighted bob haircut seemed to quiver with anticipation as she flipped through her clipboard with practiced efficiency. According to the HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4, all exterior modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. "Did you submit a form for this renovation?" She practically spat the last word, eyeing my simple wooden fence like it was an offense to her personal sensibilities, her French manicured fingernail tapping aggressively against her clipboard. I maintained my calm demeanor, gesturing toward the 3 weathered planks I had replaced with identical new ones. "This isn't a renovation, Karen. I'm just replacing some damaged wood with identical new planks. No structural or aesthetic changes whatsoever. It's basic maintenance, which is permitted under the same bylaw as you just quoted." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously, and I could practically see the wheels turning behind them, searching for any angle to exert her authority. "Well, I'll be the judge of that. The committee will need to review this immediately. In the meantime, I'll have to issue a notice of violation. We can't have people making unauthorized changes willy-nilly. That's how nice neighborhoods go downhill, you know." Before I could protest further, she was already scribbling furiously on her notepad, her handwriting no doubt as aggressive as her personality. "You'll be receiving an official notice and a $200 fine by tomorrow morning. All work must cease until approval is granted, which could take up to 30 days depending on the committee schedule." She tore the paper from her notepad with a flourish and handed it to me like she was bestowing a great honor. "Consider this your first warning, Mr. Marshall. The fines double with each subsequent violation." Subsequent violation with that final threat hanging in the air. She spun on her heel, designer of course, and marched off toward Mrs. Abernathy's house, where the poor elderly widow had dared to plant tulips that weren't on the HOA's approved flower list. I could hear Karen's shrill voice carrying across the perfectly manicured lawns, preparing for her next victim. I stood there for a moment, pruning shears hanging limply in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. $200 for routine maintenance? This had to be a mistake, or more likely a power play. Either way, I wasn't going to take it lying down. I'd purchased this home 2 years ago specifically because of its quiet, well-maintained aesthetic, but I was quickly learning that the price for such perfection was dealing with Karen and her reign of suburban terror. The next morning, just as Karen had promised, and Karen always kept her promises when they involved punishing others, an official-looking envelope was wedged into my doorframe. Inside was a notice informing me that I had violated HOA Covenant 12.4 by initiating unauthorized structural modifications and was being fined $200, due within 7 days. Payment was to be made directly to the HOA office, which coincidentally operated out of Karen's home study. At the bottom, in flowing handwriting that could only belong to Karen, was an additional note. "Perhaps next time you'll follow proper procedures. We all have to do our part to maintain property values. Welcome to Whispering Pines." That handwritten note was what did it. I wasn't normally a confrontational person. In fact, most clients appreciated my even-tempered approach to design conflicts. But this was blatantly unfair, and if I was reading between the lines correctly, possibly personal. I decided to gather evidence before confronting the situation. I photographed my fence from multiple angles, documenting that I had only replaced 3 weathered planks with identical new ones. I measured the fence height and compared it to the original blueprint specifications. Then I dug through my filing cabinet and found the HOA bylaws I'd received when purchasing the house. Sure enough, Section 12, Paragraph 4 stated that routine maintenance and like-for-like replacements do not require prior approval, followed by examples that specifically included fence panel replacement. Armed with my evidence, I walked the 3 blocks to Karen's house, a large colonial with perfectly manicured hedges shaped into geometric patterns that must have required daily attention from a professional landscaper. Her driveway housed a gleaming luxury SUV with a vanity license plate that read Hob Boss. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to remain professional, and rang the doorbell, which chimed with what sounded like the first few notes of hail to the chief. Karen opened the door, her surprised expression quickly morphing into one of annoyance when she recognized me. She was wearing an expensive-looking tennis outfit, despite no tennis courts being anywhere in our community. "Mr. Marshall, this is highly inappropriate. All HOA matters should be addressed during official meetings or in writing. We have procedures for a reason." I kept my voice level, maintaining eye contact. "I understand, Karen, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. According to the bylaws, routine maintenance doesn't require approval, and that's all I was doing. I have photos and measurements to prove it, along with the relevant bylaw section highlighted for your convenience." I held out my folder of evidence. Karen didn't even glance at it. Photos can be manipulated, and measurements can be taken incorrectly by amateurs. "The committee has already reviewed your case and made its decision. The fine stands. If you'd like to appeal, you can submit a formal request in writing with a $50 non-refundable filing fee to be considered at next month's meeting." I took a deep breath, counting silently to 5 before responding. "Then I'd like to appeal at the next HOA meeting. I'll have my appeal and filing fee submitted today. I assume I can drop it off here, since this is the official HOA office." Karen's smile was cold, not reaching her eyes, which had hardened like blue marbles. "You're welcome to try and appeal, but I should warn you, the committee rarely overturns its decisions. We have standards to maintain. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to." The door closed firmly in my face before I could respond, nearly catching the edge of my folder. As I walked home, my architect's brain was already formulating a plan. I had spent years designing spaces that had to work within strict parameters while still achieving the client's goals. If Karen wanted to play hardball over a simple fence repair, I would give her something to really complain about, all while staying perfectly within the letter of the law. It was time to fight bureaucracy with bureaucracy, and fortunately, I was fluent in both languages. The next day, I submitted a formal request to the HOA Architectural Committee for a property boundary enhancement project. My application was meticulously detailed, with professional grade drawings, perks of my job, material specifications, environmental impact assessments, shadow studies for different times of day, and references to every relevant section of the bylaws. I had spent half the night studying those bylaws, and I found something interesting. While there were restrictions on fence height in the front yard, there were no specific height limitations for side and back property lines, only that they be consistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards and constructed of approved materials. I submitted the 30-page application, complete with the required filing fee, and waited. Karen, in her role as committee chair, would have to review it personally. The malicious compliance part of me hoped she would rubber stamp it without reading the fine print, as she likely did with many applications that came with the correct fees. 3 weeks later, I received a response in my mailbox. Application approved with standard provisions. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead with Karen's signature prominently displayed at the bottom. She had signed off on it herself, probably without reading the detailed specifications or understanding the architectural drawings. I almost felt bad for what was coming. All that weekend, I hired a contractor friend and we got to work. I had taken Friday off to accept delivery of the materials, which were neatly stacked and covered in my driveway. Neighbors slowed as they drove by, curious about the massive lumber delivery and large steel posts. We removed the old 4-foot wooden fence along the side of my property, the side visible from Karen's daily power walking route, and began construction on its replacement. By Sunday evening, the framework was in place, steel posts anchored in concrete footings rising a full 14 feet into the air. The structure was already drawing attention from the neighborhood, with several people stopping to ask what I was building. I simply smiled and referred them to the approved HOA project permit displayed prominently near the construction site. Monday morning, I was enjoying my coffee on the front porch when I heard the now familiar click of heels approaching at what seemed like Olympic speed walking pace. Karen appeared in my walkway, face flushed with what I can only describe as righteous fury. Her designer exercise outfit suggested she had interrupted her morning routine specifically to confront me. What in heaven's name do you think you're doing? This is absolutely unacceptable. This monstrosity must come down immediately. I can see this prison wall from 3 blocks away. I calmly sipped my coffee, maintaining an expression of mild confusion. Good morning, Karen. Is there a problem with my approved property boundary enhancement project? I have all the permits displayed as required by Section 8 of the bylaws. Karen sputtered. Approved? No one approved this. This can't possibly. Let me see those permits right now. I went inside and returned with my folder containing the approved application, complete with Karen's own signature and the official HOA stamp. Everything is proceeding according to the approved plans. See, your signature is right here on page 3 and again on page 27, acknowledging the height specifications. The materials were all from the approved vendor list, and the color scheme matches the tertiary palette options for exterior structures. Karen snatched the papers from my hand, flipping through them frantically, her French manicured nails practically tearing the pages in her haste. This is not what I approved. You've clearly altered these plans after approval. No one would approve a 14-foot fence. This is fraud. The plans are exactly as submitted. Perhaps you should have reviewed them more carefully. Before signing off, everything is within code and compliant with HOA bylaws. There are no height restrictions for property fences, only material and aesthetic guidelines, all of which I've meticulously followed. I kept my tone helpful and informative, as if explaining a simple concept to a client. Ken's face turned an alarming shade of red that clashed with her peach-colored exercise top. Her hands were actually shaking as she thrust the papers back at me. We'll see about that. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for this evening. This thing is an eyesore and a violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. Construction must cease immediately, pending review. I smiled pleasantly, taking another sip of my coffee. I'll look forward to discussing it at the meeting. In the meantime, construction will continue as approved. The bylaws are quite clear that once approval is granted, work may only be halted with a formal cease and desist order approved by a majority of the board, not just the president. I'd be happy to provide the relevant section if you need a refresher. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, resembling a designer-clad fish out of water. Finally, she managed to hiss through clenched teeth, 7 p.m. sharp at the clubhouse. Bring your so-called permits. With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, phone already pressed to her ear, no doubt rallying her allies on the board. Over the next several hours, my fence took shape. It wasn't just tall, it was a statement. The 14-foot structure was a modern vertical garden system with built-in planters housing cascading vines and flowering plants. Solar-powered accent lights were installed at various heights, and a sophisticated irrigation system ensured everything stayed lush and green. Objectively speaking, it was a stunning piece of landscape architecture that had already drawn admiring comments from several neighbors who had stopped by to watch the installation. By late afternoon, the basic structure was complete, though the plannings would take another day or two to finish. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early, armed with copies of the bylaws, my approved application, and photographs of other aesthetic enhancements throughout the neighborhood that had never faced scrutiny. I also brought my laptop with a presentation that included 3D renderings of the completed project, comparative property value analyses, and environmental benefit assessments. The room was unusually full. Word had spread about the fence dispute, and it seemed many homeowners were curious or perhaps just enjoyed the drama. Several nodded to me as I entered, a few even giving subtle thumbs-up gestures. Karen sat at the head table with the other 4 board members, looking confident and composed, but the tight line of her lips betrayed her tension. I noticed she had changed into a business-like outfit, a blazer and skirt, no doubt to project authority. At precisely 7 p.m., Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is called to order. We're here to address a serious violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards committed by Mr. James Marshall of 722 Oakwood Drive. Mr. Marshall has constructed an excessive and unsightly boundary structure that must be removed immediately. The vice president of the board, a retired judge named Walter Simmons, leaned forward. Point of order, Karen. If I understand correctly, this project was approved by the architectural committee. Is that correct? Karen's smile was tight. The approval was obtained under false pretenses with deliberately misleading documentation. Walter turned to Mr. Marshall. Would you care to address these allegations? I was then invited to explain myself. I calmly walked to the front of the room, connected my laptop to the projector, and began my presentation with the practiced ease of someone who regularly pitches designs to demanding clients. Thank you all for coming tonight. What we're discussing is a fully approved landscape architecture project that not only complies with all HOA bylaws, but actually enhances property values in our community. I clicked through slides showing the completed design, the ecological benefits of vertical gardens, and similar installations in upscale neighborhoods nationwide. The structure incorporates sustainable materials, native plants, and water-saving technology. It's already been featured in the Regional Architectural Digest online blog as an innovative approach to urban green space. Murmurs of approval spread through the room as I showed before and after property value analyses. As you can see, similar installations have increased adjacent property values by an average of 6% in comparable neighborhoods. The plantings include only species from the HOA-approved list, and the irrigation system actually reduces water usage compared to traditional landscaping. I transitioned smoothly to the procedural aspects. Furthermore, I'd like to address the procedural issues that brought us here tonight. 3 weeks ago, I was illegally fined $200 for performing routine maintenance on my original fence, maintenance that is explicitly permitted without prior approval under our bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4. I displayed the relevant section on the screen and distributed copies of the bylaw sections, my documentation of the original repair work, and the improperly issued fine. This appears to be part of a pattern of selective enforcement that has affected other homeowners as well. After receiving this inappropriate fine, I decided to ensure all projects were meticulously documented and approved. I displayed my comprehensive application and the approval with Karen's signature clearly visible. Every aspect of this project was detailed in my 30-page submission, including precise height specifications, materials, and aesthetic elements. The application received full approval, as evidenced by the signatures on pages 3, 15, and 27. If the architectural committee failed to properly review the submission before granting approval, that's an administrative failure, not a compliance issue on my part. Karen interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. This is not about the previous incident. We're here to address the current violation. That fence is 14 feet tall. It's practically a wall. No reasonable person would consider this consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. With all due respect, Mrs. Weissman, there is no violation. My project was submitted according to procedure and received official approval by you. I projected her signature onto the screen, magnified several times. The bylaws contain no specific height limitations for side and rear property fences, only that they be consistent with aesthetic standards and constructed of approved materials. Both conditions have been met. The meeting quickly spiraled beyond Karen's control. Other homeowners stood up to share their own stories of what they perceived as arbitrary enforcement and excessive fines. One elderly gentleman had been fined for having a bird feeder visible from the street. A young couple had received violations for children's toys left in their fenced backyard. A woman near the back explained how she'd been fined for having rose bushes that were 6 inches taller than the specified maximum in the garden guidelines. The dam had broken, and 3 years of frustration came pouring out. Karen attempted to regain control, banging her gavel repeatedly. We're getting off topic. This meeting is specifically about Mr. Marshall's fence violation. As the complaints mounted, Walter Simmons cleared his throat loudly. When the room quieted, he spoke with measured authority that came from decades on the bench. It seems to me that we have a more fundamental issue here than one fence. I've been on this board for 2 years, and I don't recall ever seeing Mr. Marshall's original application, despite being on the architectural committee myself. In fact, I'm noticing that many of these enforcement actions were taken without full board review, which is concerning. Karen's professionally maintained smile faltered. As president, I have certain executive authorities to expedite routine matters. Walter continued calmly. I'd like to make a motion to conduct a full audit of all HOA financial records and enforcement actions for the past 3 years, to be performed by an independent third party. I'm particularly interested in understanding the flow of funds from fines and how those decisions have been made. Karen's face drained of color so rapidly I was momentarily concerned for her health. That's completely unnecessary and outside the scope of this meeting. We're here to discuss a single violation, not conduct a fishing expedition. Walter was unmoved. I move that all pending fines and violations be suspended until this audit is complete and that Mrs. Wiseman recuse herself from enforcement actions during this period due to apparent conflicts of interest. Another board member, a quiet accountant named Rachel Wong, who rarely spoke at meetings, seconded the motion. Karen looked betrayed, her eyes darting between the board members who had previously supported her without question. The motion was quickly put to a vote and, despite Karen's objections, passed by an overwhelming margin. As the meeting concluded, Karen sat stunned at the head table, watching as homeowners gathered around me to get a closer look at my fence designs and share their own HOA horror stories. Several people asked for my business card, interested in similar installations for their own properties. Over the next week, my fence project was completed, the vertical garden coming to life with cascading flowers and greenery. Far from being an eyesore, it had become something of a neighborhood attraction, with people walking by specifically to admire it. I even noticed Karen's next-door neighbor talking to my contractor about installation options. But the bigger development came a week after the meeting when the preliminary audit findings were worse than anyone expected. The independent accountant discovered that over $60,000 in HOA fines had been collected over the past 3 years, but only about half that amount had been deposited into the HOA account. The rest had apparently been diverted to a separate account under Karen's personal control, ostensibly for administrative expenses that were never authorized by the board. There were other irregularities, too. Vendors for HOA maintenance were all companies owned by Karen's friends, charging premium rates for basic services. The approved plant list coincided exactly with the inventory of Karen's sister's garden center. Most damning of all, properties that had received the most violations were predominantly those owned by people who had opposed Karen in previous HOA elections. When confronted with this evidence at an emergency board meeting, Karen's professional facade finally cracked completely. Karen shouted hysterically, "You ungrateful people have no idea how much work it takes to maintain standards in this community. Do you think perfection happens by accident? I've dedicated 3 years of my life to protecting your property values. I deserve compensation for my time and expertise. That fence, that ridiculous, outrageous fence, is exactly the kind of tacky individualism that I've been fighting to prevent." She jabbed a finger in my direction, her designer bracelet jangling with the force of her gesture. "This is all your fault. You and your architectural monstrosity. You've undermined everything I've worked for." Walter Simmons stood up, his voice grave but calm. "Mrs. Wiseman, The board has unanimously voted to remove you as president, effective immediately. We've also been advised to contact the authorities regarding the misappropriation of funds. I'm sorry, but you need to surrender all HOA records and property now. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, no sound coming out. Her perfectly manicured hand clutched at her designer blouse as the reality of her situation slowly sank in. In that moment, standing in the community clubhouse, surrounded by neighbors she had terrorized for years, Karen Wisman looked small and pathetic, a petty tyrant whose kingdom had crumbled around her, all because she couldn't resist flexing her power over 3 replaced fence planks.